Hi, welcome to the channel. Now, not all ideas for videos go as planned. Some require a bit of saving or convincing of yourself that they're worth saving, and this is kind of one of them. Now, the idea on this occasion was inspired by Ollie Bearman getting the call out of the blue to race for Ferrari in Formula One. I mean, nothing like being dropped in the deep end. Now, I could have taken any random bit of information that came out and ran with it. There were some great facts running around that weekend. Ollie's the third youngest driver to start an F1 race at 18 years and 305 days. He's the youngest to ever drive for Ferrari and the youngest Brit ever to race in F1. He only missed out in Q3 by 0.036 seconds after only having one practice session in the car, nearly displacing Lewis Hamilton. And despite his lack of experience in the car, he only finished 24 seconds behind Charles, who's having a pretty decent race himself. He was also the first British driver to score points on debut since Paul di Resta in 2011. Now, the thing that caught my eye, though, was that 4 positions in a row in the top 10 were held by British drivers. In response to a post from Silverstone on Twitter, I replied, when was the last time that 4 drivers from the same nation finished in the top 10? And whilst I didn't get an answer to that, they did later post that it was the first time 4 Brits had scored points since like 1968. And whether it had anything to do with my tweet or not, I'm going to take credit for them supplying that information. But it did give me an idea, though. As any other nation had 4 drivers in the top 10 between those years. Now, in fairness, it's not really a surprise that there was a race with 4 British drivers in the points in the 60s. It was the decade of Lotus, BRM, and towards the end of the decade, Tyrrell. Sterling Moss was the golden boy of British racing at the start of it. We also have Jim Clark, Graham Hill, John Surtees, and Jackie Stewart paving the way for future British stars. In fact, British drivers won world championships in like 62, 63, 64, 65, 68, and 1969. And since Mike Hawthorn took the first title for a British driver in 1958, 10 British drivers have taken the title. So far so straightforward. Now, let's return to Ollie Bearman for a bit. The 97th driver to race for Ferrari, and according to the same article, the 776th F1 driver. Problem is, when I started looking into it, different articles use very different definitions of what an F1 driver actually is. Another article by F1 Bytes posted in 2017 said there were 842 F1 drivers up to that point. That's a very different number and leads to a problem that keeps raising its head again and again. I started off by researching which nationality had the most drivers on the grid during which season. Started looking at Autosport, as they're a well-known publication, so I thought that should be pretty reliable. Apparently that was over-optimistic, because by 2014, half the information of the drivers was missing, and I'd had a fake Italian show up. So I switched to the F1 website and their drivers' championship table, which initially showed all the drivers. I was looking through the 90s before I realised that, as well as there being British drivers finishing second, third, and fourth in the 1995 championship, which no one remembers because Michael was just too good that year, the F1 page had started to only list point scorers. It shouldn't matter too much, you see. Well, looking back at the 1968 season, just as an example, there were 44 drivers who tried to compete in Formula One weekends, and 20 of them didn't score points. This during a time when reliability was so horrendous. The Jochen Rindt raced in all 12 rounds, taking 2 podiums, but still finished behind Jim Clark, who sadly only raced in 1 round before dying next time out in the F2 race at Hockenheim. This happened because Jochen's DNF'd the other 10 races. Think it's any better to try and make sense of the 1970s? There were 20 point scorers in the 1976 season, whilst, according to Wiki, which I appreciate isn't the most reliable source, there were 71 racers trying to get a car on a grid at any one race or another that season. Now, in fairness, that number is actually somewhat less, as drivers might try getting a drive at multiple teams during the season. Leila Lombardi is on the list 3 separate times, while Wolf Williams, Ensign, and Hesketh ran 14 drivers between them over the course of the year, including Jackie Ickx and Chris Amon making appearances for both Wolf Williams and Ensign. Now, I remember watching F1 in the 1990s, when you'd have 33 cars trying to qualify for 26 grid slots. So some of these teams were so poor that the cars were basically second-hand, built from spare parts and poorly maintained death traps. Yeah, I watched Josh Revels under a motor video. Some of these guys have managed less laps over a whole season in the practice sessions than Ollie Bearman got in 1 race, which is also something they'd never get to do, as they'd never qualify. but they took part in the event and tried to qualify. So do they count as Formula One drivers? And if they do, then what about the people who do FP1 sessions as young or reserve drivers? They're still taking part in an official F1 session. And we've just found three different possible definitions of a Formula One driver. So no wonder it's kind of confusing. According to Wiki, yes, we're back to that again. Statistically, the British are most likely to have had multiple drivers getting into the top 10 in a race, as there have been 164 drivers from Great Britain to attempt to race a Formula One car. After that, it's 58 Germans, four of which are listed as East German, and 57 Americans, mostly from the 50s when the Indy 500 was listed as a round on the F1 calendar. And no, I'm not going to begin to check how many times there were four Americans in the points for Indy. So, with older seasons being something of a minefield, are there any seasons in recent history where we might have got four drivers in the top 10 from any of the other nations in F1? Probably the strongest nation in terms of numbers on the grid in recent years are the Germans. After 2000, the Michael Schumacher effect started to come into being, and from 2000 till 2017, there was never less than three Germans on the grid, with there never being anything less than five, sometimes even six or seven by the time we had drivers in for one-off showings between 2007 and 2012. Turns out it's not that unusual to get four in the top 10 when your nationality makes up a quarter of the grid. It happened three times in 2008, twice in 2009, with the starring turn being at Singapore in 2008, a race that is rather better known for other things, unfortunately, where four of the top six finishers were German. 2010 saw seven Germans on the grid at various points, with Sebastian Vettel, Michael Schumacher, Nico Rosberg, Nico Hulkenberg, Adrian Sutil, and Timo Glock all in full-time drives, and Nick Heidfeld coming in to replace Pedro de la Rosa at Sauber at the end of the season. This resulted in six races where four German drivers finished in the top 11, a further three where there were four in the top 10, and at the British Grand Prix that year there were five in the top 10. By 2011, it had become almost not worthy of mention as Germans filled four positions in the top 10 on five occasions come race day in the European Grand Prix, British Grand Prix, German Grand Prix, Belgian Grand Prix, and Indian Grand Prix. This was very much the high point for German Grand Prix racing, though. Over the next few seasons, the numbers on the grid would start to reduce, and by 2014, there were only four on the grid. Several times that season, there were three Germans in the top six, but the other driver was Adrian Sutil in a Sauber, and he scored nothing all season. 2012 saw four in the top 10 at the German Grand Prix, and it was the final time any nation got four in the points prior to Bahrain 2024 was the Singapore Grand Prix in 2013, where German drivers finished 1st, 4th, 9th, and 10th. Now, is there anything particularly worthwhile to take from this? Now, I was going to say that to regularly get four drivers of the same nationality in the top 10, you need at least five drivers from the same nation all within top teams. And that's probably true, at least now. I had a look at the 1991 season on Wiki, yeah, I know, for a bit of a laugh. And it was kind of as nuts as I expected. I should add this as a disclaimer that, as I mentioned earlier in the video, there were a lot of teams who didn't qualify for races and the reliability was pretty poor at the time. The points only went down to sixth. However, there were 13 Italian drivers trying to compete in races that season. Six would score no points, five scored 10 points or less, but there were six races where four or more Italians finished in the top 10 that season. The high point being the Australian Grand Prix, where six of the top 10 were Italian. But as I said, points only went down to sixth, and it was one of the shortest races in history, so half points were awarded, resulting in those six drivers only scoring a collective 1.5 points for that race between all of them. At the Portuguese Grand Prix that year, not only were there four Italians in the top 10, there were also four Brazilians. Has there ever been another occasion that two nations have got four drivers in the top 10? If you know one, then please answer in the comments. Well, anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and please like, say hi in the comments, all that good stuff. Take care, and I'll see you later. Bye bye for now.